Here's him.
Hey, witches.
Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime with our surprise guest, Chaos, because he is purring very loudly into the mic. He's actually not even near the mic, but
No, he's not. He's laying on my desk, and the mic is way up there, but
it's
you
loud.
can
It's so
still
loud.
hear it. Chaos,
So,
you're being
yeah,
loud. You're being too loud. You need to calm down.
we love it, but
Anyway,
also,
this is kind of a true crime shadowed past crossover. When I went searching for something to cover for true crime, this is what I came up with. Um, and it happened in 1945. So it's
fairly
got like some
recent.
supernatural elements. But in any event, this is the story of Charles Walton.
This is a story all about how my leg got twisted.
This happened in Warwickshire, England, on February 14th in 1945, which is exactly 20 years before my father was born, in case you wanted that extra tidbit.
I
Um,
appreciate it.
in this the end of World War II, right?
Hmm.
Um, so the things are kind of getting quieter, and I don't know, it's still like a dark time, right? Like they're recovering.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's not the Great Depression, but it's pretty close.
right. We're in the English countryside, on an isolated hillside known as Meon Hill, I'm guessing. I did not look up the pronunciation, so I apologize. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong. There's a 74-year-old farm laborer who goes to work as he does every day. He carries only the tools of his trade, and by nightfall, he is dead.
Damn.
Am I talking too much? Fuck me, I guess. Bye, chaos. Um, he his body lays alone in a hedgerow. His throat is cut. He had been beaten, and a pitchfork was driven through his neck, pinning him to the frozen earth. The murder was savage, the
Hell yeah.
motive unknown. But before detectives could uncover the killer, the village had already found an explanation. Charles Walton, they whispered, was not just an old farmhand. He was a witch. Or,
Guys, come on. We just ended World War II. Like, for the love of God,
right, it's 1945. Come on.
calm
They
down.
they believed he was. Someone believed he was. So this is one of Britain's most unsettling unsolved murders. A case where ancient folklore, wartime fear, and one brutal killing become forever intertwined. Apparently, I can't fucking speak tonight, so I
It's only
apologize in
Tuesday.
advance for that. Um, the question is, was Charles Walton the victim of a personal grudge, a random act of unimaginable violence, or did centuries-old superstition turn an ordinary man into the center of an extraordinary legend? Long before police officers climbed the slopes of Meon Hill, people feared it. Um, this hill was more than 600 feet tall, which is still like not super, super tall, but it's like a big hill. Okay.
Yeah.
It dominates the landscape of southern Warwickshire. Even today, it's easy to see why the hill has inspired some stories for generations. On misty mornings, the top of it does seem to disappear into the clouds. When storms roll across the fields, the shadows race across the steep slopes. And after sunset, the silence can feel almost unnatural.
I'm kind of picturing the kind of hill, those, in like Austria where they play soccer on like a slant, like basically on the mountain, or like when they do, like when they roll down the hill and they just keep fucking going and going and going.
Oh, okay.
That's
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
like you could see it and you're like, man, that's not a bad hill. But then like You haven't even
Yeah.
been there and up
Right?
it and down it. That's the kinda hill I'm thinking of.
Well, either way, England is a land where history often overlaps with folklore because it has such a long history. There are ancient standing stones, Roman roads, forgotten burial mounds. Legends pass from one generation to the next until no one remembers where exactly these stories began. Around this particular area, around Meon Hill, people told tales of witches gathering beneath the moon, of strange lights drifting through the fields, of unexplained deaths of livestock. Most of the stories are just that, stories, just like most witchcraft stories are like they're looking for a supernatural cause for a natural event. There is no historical evidence that Meon Hill was the site of organized witchcraft or occult rituals, but word of mouth, folklore, it shapes how people see the world. And sometimes it shapes how we explain things. Not sometimes, most of the time, it is how we explain things that we cannot understand. By 1945, England had endured nearly 6 years of war. Families had been living with rationing, blackout curtains covered the windows at night. Thousands of young men were still overseas. These people were exhausted, and a lot of the times in stressful or uncertain times, old superstitions find fresh life. Um, and it was in this atmosphere that Charles Walton lived a quiet, unremarkable life, or so it seemed. He was 74 years old. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. He wasn't known outside of the small villages scattered across rural Warwickshire. For most of his life, he worked as a farm laborer. The work was demanding, long hours, cold mornings, aching hands. This kind of life that rarely found its way into history books. Neighbors described him as quiet and reserved, a man who preferred to work rather than to have conversation. Each morning, he followed nearly the exact same routine. He walked in the fields, he trimmed the hedgerows, he repaired the fences, worked until the daylight disappeared, and then went home. To most people, he was just kind of part of the landscape. He was familiar as like the stone cottages, the rolling hills. But as often happens in small villages, stories follow people. After his death, some locals would claim that Walton possessed an unusual knowledge of herbs and animals. How they would know that when he really didn't talk, he just kind of did his thing and kept his head down, I don't know. But they claimed that that's what happened. Others remember hearing older relatives speak of him with quiet suspicion. Years after his death, these recollections would grow into dramatic tales, with some insisting Walton had been called a witch for decades. Historians, as they do, urge caution. Many of these stories weren't recorded until after the murder, when newspapers and authors began searching for sensational explanations. It's difficult to separate genuine local folklore from memories that were reshaped by this tragedy. Whether the rumors existed before his death or became amplified afterwards is uncertain. What is certain is that on the morning of February 14th, 1945, Charles Walton left home carrying the tools he needed to trim hedges on a nearby farm. There was nothing unusual about the day, no signs that he feared for his safety, no indication that he would never return. By sunset, the peaceful routine he'd followed for decades would come to a horrifying end, and the mystery of Meon Hill would begin. Jesus Christ, my computer just did something super crazy. Okay. Um, so the tools of his trade that he's carrying to trim these hedges is a bill hook for cutting branches, pruning equipment, and a walking stick. This work would keep him isolated for most of the day. It's 1945. There were no cell phones. There were no Walkmans clipped to a worker's belt. No easy way to call for help. If something happened in those lonely fields, no one would know about it until someone came looking. As daylight faded and temperatures dropped, Walton still hadn't returned home. But at first, there wasn't really any cause for alarm. Farm work often ran late. They just didn't think much of it. As darkness settled over Warwickshire, concern began to grow. Neighbors and fellow workers set out across the fields calling his name, and the only reply was the wind. Then, someone spotted him, lying near the hedgerow, face down, motionless. At first, they thought maybe he had fallen or had a heart attack, some sort of accident. But as they drew closer, they realized that they were looking at something far more horrifying. Charles Walton had clearly been murdered with extraordinary violence. His throat had been slashed so deeply that it was immediately obvious he hadn't died naturally. There were injuries to his head suggesting he'd been struck during the attack, and perhaps most disturbing of all was that pitchfork that had been thrust through his neck, pinning part of his clothing and body to the ground. The image would become one of the most enduring and unsettling details of the entire case. Even today, it's the most common detail that people remember about the case. Police later determined that the pitchfork was likely a tool found at or near the scene, because remember, they're on a farm. Where do pitchforks get used? On a farm. So they're thinking that it was just a convenient tool rather than something that was carried there specifically for the attack. However, as superstition does, the symbolism of a pitchfork through his neck was hard for people to ignore. It was impossible for people not to imagine this the symmetry of that. There were no obvious signs of robbery. His money was still with him. There was no indication someone had searched his pockets. The attack appeared deeply personal, or at the very least, frenzied. But no one heard screams. No one reported seeing anyone running from the scene. The killer vanished into the countryside as quietly as they had arrived, and by the following morning, detectives from Scotland Yard had been notified. What they expected to investigate was a rural homicide, and what they encountered instead was a mystery that would haunt British criminal history for decades. When a murder baffled local police in mid-20th century Britain, one name often surfaced, and no, it is not Sherlock Holmes. It
He's
is
fake.
Detective, I know, it is instead Detective Superintendent Robert Fabian. Fabian had built a reputation solving difficult cases for the Metropolitan Police, and later he became well known through his memoirs and the television series inspired by them. But in 1945, he was an experienced investigator with decades of practical detective work behind him. He wasn't interested in ghost stories. He believed in evidence, witnesses, timelines, and facts. When Fabian arrived in Warwickshire, he found a crime scene that offered remarkably little of any of those things. The first challenge was the location itself. It took place in an open countryside. Unlike a city street, there were no rows of houses overlooking the field. There were no shopkeepers, no passing motorists. Very few people would have a reason to be near this place on a cold February afternoon. Any footprints left by the killer were vulnerable to weather, livestock, and the movements of those who had discovered Walton's body before police arrived. Investigators carefully examined the scene. They documented Walton's injuries. They studied the surrounding ground, looked for signs of a struggle. Although Walton had defensive wounds suggesting he tried to protect himself, there was little to indicate a prolonged fight. The attack may have been sudden, fast, perhaps even from someone Walton knew well enough not to fear approaching. And one fact became immediately clear. Whoever killed him had almost certainly possessed considerable strength. The injuries were severe and had been inflicted with unmistakable violence. Fabian's team began with what every homicide investigation begins with. They ask a simple question. Who had seen Charles Walton alive? Witnesses helped establish his movements throughout the day. He was observed working in the field during the afternoon. Nothing appeared unusual, no arguments, no visible signs of distress. And then silence. His final hours simply disappeared. The detectives expanded their search. They talked to farm workers, landowners, owners, neighbors, travelers, anyone who might have crossed paths with Walton that day. Interview after interview produced the same results. No one seemed to know anything. Or no one had seen enough to realize what they knew.
Or they were covering it up.
Or that. Fabian later reflected that the countryside could hide secrets remarkably well. The long fields, open fields swallowed sounds, hedgerows blocked visibility. A crime committed only a few hundred yards away might go entirely unnoticed. The investigators considered whether Walton had interrupted a theft, but nothing supported the theory. There was no evidence of robbery. So attention shifted towards the motive. Had he quarreled with someone? Did he have enemies? Um, he wasn't a known troublemaker. He wasn't wealthy enough to invite financial disputes. There was no evidence of a bitter family feud. One of the strangest aspects of the investigation was how ordinary Charles Walton appeared to be. Ordinary men are rarely murdered in extraordinary ways. As days turned into weeks, Fabian and his colleagues interviewed dozens of people. Some accounts suggest that well over 100 interviews were completed. Every promising lead dissolved. Every rumor seemed to point nowhere. The investigation widened beyond Walton's immediate acquaintances. Could a stranger have wandered into the area, or perhaps a deserter from the war, a transient laborer, someone suffering from severe mental illness? Isn't that always the answer? Each possibility had weaknesses. The isolated location suggested familiarity with the countryside. The lack of theft suggested a motive beyond simple crime, and the sheer brutality hinted at intense emotion. But no suspect emerged, no confession arrived, and no convincing witness stepped forward. And when something changed, it didn't come from forensic evidence or from a witness. It came from the villagers. At first, the stories were offered almost apologetically and quietly, as though speaking them aloud might itself invite bad luck. Someone remembered hearing that Walton had unusual knowledge of animals. Another recalled an elderly relative refusing to cross paths with him. Someone else mentioned old tales of witches on Meon Hill. Fabian listened. I mean, professional detectives rarely dismiss information simply because it sounds strange, but he still did not accept folklore as evidence. But the stories kept coming. One villager claimed Walton could supposedly charm livestock. Um, there were whispers that he'd been seen muttering over sick cattle. Um, it's important to
Listen,
remember that.
I would mutter over any animal because I'm talking to them, okay? Not because
Right,
I'm doing witchcraft.
right. But you might be. I don't know.
According to them, yes.
But it's important to remember that many of these claims were recorded after the murder and may have been shaped by hindsight. Once newspapers began reporting that the killing might have occult connections, memories and rumors became difficult to untangle from documented fact. Fabian himself remained skeptical. His job was to find a murderer, not confirm village legends. But he couldn't ignore the effect these beliefs had on the investigation. Whether true or false, they revealed something important. The people of Meon Hill were no longer talking only about a homicide, they were talking about witchcraft. And we all know once that door opens, the case will never again be viewed just as another unsolved murder.
All I'm
So,
saying is, what if it was witchcraft, but it wasn't him? He was passing by, and they were like, "All right, he's gonna be the next one."
yeah. So it kind of continues. That's the basically end of his story. It's not been solved. We don't know. Um, but people continue with the folklore. Everything was blamed on a witch, right? Even though the witch trials had ended centuries earlier, belief in witchcraft never disappeared completely, and especially in rural communities. Um, by 1945, most people would have laughed at the idea of a practicing witch, but most isn't everyone, especially in isolated farming villages where folklore was woven into daily life. I mean, if you think about it, when even growing up semi-southern, um, we had all the old wives' tales. Those are witchcraft.
Yeah.
Fight me, they're witchcraft. Like
What? Hold on. What about the people that live in Appalachia? Like,
witchcraft. Okay, I'm just saying it's witchcraft. So I definitely get it. I get where they're coming from. So the story repeated in later years over and over and over again was that Charles Walton possessed an unusual knowledge of herbs, animals, and the rhythms of the countryside. A lifetime of farming would give a person exactly that kind of knowledge, but in communities shaped by folklore, sometimes practical knowledge becomes something else. Because this is also the same thing with the like medicine women of the witch trials. Like they just had practical knowledge of
What worked and what didn't work.
right medicinal properties of things and were considered witches. Um then later there was another name that crops up. A woman called Anne Tennant. According to local tradition, Anne Tennant lived near Meon Hill centuries earlier. The story says that she was accused of witchcraft after neighbors blamed her for misfortune and failed harvests. Jesus fucking Christ. Legend claims that before she died, she cursed the hill. Some versions even insist that violence would continue there until the curse was fulfilled. It's an eerie tale. There's just one problem. Historians have searched for evidence that Anne Tennant existed exactly as the legend describes, and they found remarkably little. Um, so this is a local legend in the area, and they're like, did this inspire the murderer? Did the murder breathe new life into the old legend? Nobody knows. But Fabian understood something important. Whether these stories were true didn't matter nearly as much as whether or not people believed in them, because beliefs change behavior.
Mhm.
If you don't believe that, talk to any religious person anywhere. Literally anywhere, any religious person. Um they change behavior and they influence what witnesses notice, what they choose to forget. So these stories continued to multiply, and there was no evidence that Charles Walton was one of these people. But after his death, he became one because of the manner of his death. Um, the pitchfork. Almost immediately, speculation took hold that driving a pitchfork through Walton's neck had been symbolic and ritualistic, a way to pin a witch to the earth. It's a compelling story. It has appeared in books, documentaries, many retellings of the case, but historians urge caution. While European folklore contains many tales about preventing the restless dead from rising, there is little evidence that pinning a witch with a pitchfork was a recognized or widespread English practice. It doesn't mean that the killer wasn't acting on some personal superstition. It just means we don't know. And since that like persona of Charles Walton didn't come about until after his death, it seems unlikely.
I mean, what? How old is he? 70, 65, something?
70 something, yeah.
That's a minimum 60 something years of doing the same exact shit. Or a
Right.
maximum of that, yeah.
Yeah. So by spring of 1945, the investigation had reached an impasse. Weeks had become months. The fields of Meon Hill were beginning to turn green again, but the case file remained stubbornly cold. No murder weapon had been recovered. No eyewitness came forward. No confession arrived. The killer simply vanished, or never really left, because it could have totally just been someone in the village. We don't
Yeah.
know. Fabian refused to believe that the answer lay in curses or black magic. He believed Charles Walton had been killed by a human being, someone with flesh and blood, someone capable of extraordinary violence, and someone who walked away unnoticed. So they turned to the most fundamental question again: motive. Who benefited from his death? The answer appeared to be no one. Walton owned very little. He didn't have known enemies. He wasn't involved in legal disputes. He wasn't a wealthy landowner. By all accounts, he lived a modest, predictable life, which only deepened the mystery of his death. Murders this violent rarely happen without powerful emotion, and so investigators considered whether the attack had been impulsive, maybe an argument in the field spiraled out of control. But the crime scene and the sustained injuries don't suggest that. His throat had been cut, he'd severe blunt force injuries, and then came the pitchfork. So it could have been staging. Like maybe he got in a fist fight with somebody and they accidentally killed him and then staged it to look like this. But if it was, why? What message were they trying to? Were they just trying to really throw people off? Maybe. Um,
And honestly, it could have been, I mean, I'm not saying this is legitimate, but I mean, somebody from the war, there's people who come back and they get so shell shocked with like the way things are that they go off grid and they hide and
mhm.
they see something coming over a hill. They
Yep.
may think that they're still in the trenches and they're a German soldiers coming over the hill at
Oh, girl. Fabian also explored a
listen,
possibility that has largely faded from modern retellings: the psychological effects of war.
whatever.
Britain in 1945 was a nation carrying invisible wounds. Millions experienced loss. Thousands of servicemen were returning home bearing trauma. And in 1945, they didn't. Their trauma wasn't a thing. Trauma informed care was not a thing. You just went back to life. There was no like post traumatic
Transition.
stress. Yeah, there was nothing. People simply described someone as changed by the war, and that was it. So, could Charles Walton have crossed paths with a deeply troubled individual, someone capable of explosive violence, someone who mistook him for a German soldier? Like it could have been anything like that.
Yeah.
There were whispers of another theory, a local dispute, arguments over land boundaries, over work, personal insults, but that doesn't seem likely because those stories weren't consistent. Fabian is deeply frustrated by this. Um, and he's speculates like, is it truly that people know nothing, like genuinely know nothing? Or do they know more that they're willing to say? Because rural communities can be intensely private.
Mhm.
Um, and that's still true today, and it's kind of creepy and gross, but it happens. Um, and that could be what happened here. Somebody protecting somebody else and not saying what happened. But in many ways, Charles Walton's murders stops belonging solely to history and became part of folklore. Each generation added another layer, another theory, another ghost story, another certainty built on uncertain ground. The facts became harder to separate from the fiction, and perhaps that's exactly why the mystery has endured, because once a crime becomes a legend, the legend is often easier to remember than the victim. But before we leave Meon Hill, there's one final question worth asking. Not whether witches existed, not whether ancient curses haunted the hill, but whether these stories distracted everyone from seeing the killer standing in plain sight, or worse, protected them. More than 80 years have passed since Charles Walton's body was discovered on the slopes of Meon Hill. The hedgerows have grown back, the seasons have turned thousands of times, and the people who knew Walton are gone, and with them, many of the answers. Today, we know far more about criminal investigation than we did in 1945. Modern investigators would have searched the scene for trace DNA, collected microscopic fibers, analyzed blood spatter, mapped the crime scene in 3 dimensions, interviewed witnesses using techniques developed decades after Walton's death. But in 1945, those tools simply didn't exist. And once the scene was disturbed by weather, livestock, and well meaning neighbors, precious evidence may have been lost forever. So, some historians believe the case was simply a tragic victim of its time, and others wonder whether the killer was interviewed and dismissed because there wasn't enough evidence to charge them. And then there are those who remain convinced that the truth lies somewhere inside the folklore. Not because they believe in witches, but because they believe people do extraordinary things when they believe they are acting against evil. So, whether you think it was folklore or not, this killer was never caught. This crime is unsolved to this day. And at this point, he will never be caught. Or they will never be caught. But let us know what you think, because I'm curious. I tend to agree that it was probably someone who happened upon him accidentally.
Yeah.
And like you said, like maybe somebody that had lasting effects from the war, and it was just a tragic wrong place at the wrong time kind of vibe.
Mhm.
But we
It's
will
very
never
possible.
know.
Until someone does a Ouija board out there and finds them, but even
Oh.
then.
Witches.
Yeah. But anyways, until next time.
Bye.